The bullet whistled past Graham Lawson's head so close he felt the heat of it graze his ear. But he barely flinched as he dove behind the water trough outside the Mercantile in Las Cruces, New Mexico, his Colt already drawn and returning fire at the three outlaws who had decided robbing the bank on this sweltering July afternoon in 1878 was a fine idea. Graham had been a cowboy for the better part of 6 years, driving cattle from Texas to Kansas and back again, but he had settled in Las Cruces 3 months ago to work at the Double R Ranch just outside town, tired of the endless trail and the loneliness that came with it. The gunfight lasted maybe 5 minutes before the sheriff and his deputies arrived, and by then two of the outlaws were bleeding in the dust, and the third was galloping away toward the Oregon Mountains with a bullet in his shoulder. Graham holstered his weapon and tipped his hat to the sheriff, a grizzled man named Tom Garrett, who had seen more action than most men twice his age. "Obliged for the help, Lawson," Sheriff Garrett said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Those boys have been causing trouble from here to El Paso. Just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time," Graham replied, wiping the dust from his face with his bandana. "Or the right place, depending on how you see it." The sheriff nodded and went about his business, and Graham decided he had spent enough time in town for one day. He mounted his sorrel mare, a reliable horse named Ruby, and started back toward the ranch, but as he rode past the row of modest adobe houses that lined the eastern edge of Las Cruces, he heard something that made him pull up on the reins. It was a voice, sweet and clear, humming a melody he did not recognize, but found instantly captivating. The tune was simple, almost childlike in its purity, yet it carried a depth of emotion that stopped him in his tracks. He turned Ruby toward the sound and found himself looking at a young woman standing in the yard of a small whitewashed house, her hands working rhythmically as she scrubbed clothing in a large wooden washtub. She had not noticed him yet, so absorbed was she in her task and her song. Her dark hair was pulled back in a loose braid that hung down her back, and she wore a simple calico dress the color of cornflowers, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Her face, what he could see of it in profile, was lovely in an unassuming way, with high cheekbones and a delicate nose. But it was not her beauty that held his attention. It was the pure joy that radiated from her as she hummed, the way she seemed completely content in this simple moment, finding happiness in the mundane task of washing clothes. In all his 26 years, Graham had never seen anything quite like it. Most people he knew, himself included, went through life looking for happiness in the big moments, the exciting adventures, the accumulation of wealth or status. But here was this woman, finding it in soap and water and sunshine. He must have stared too long, because she suddenly looked up and caught his eye. Her humming stopped abruptly, and a blush crept across her cheeks. "I apologize, miss," Graham said quickly, removing his hat. "I did not mean to intrude. I was just passing by and I heard your song. It is very beautiful." The young woman wiped her hands on her apron, her blush deepening. "It is nothing, just something my mother used to hum when I was little. I did not realize anyone could hear me." "I am glad I could," Graham said, and he meant it. "I am Graham Lawson. I work at the Double R Ranch." She studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to be wary or welcoming. Finally, she smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Winnie Douglas. I live here with my father. He is a carpenter in town." "It is a pleasure to meet you, Miss Douglas," Graham said. He wanted to say more, to find some reason to continue the conversation, but his mind had gone blank. All he could think about was how the light caught in her hair and the way her smile transformed her entire face. "Likewise, Mr. Lawson," Winnie said, and there was a hint of amusement in her eyes, as if she could read his thoughts. "You were involved in that trouble in town, were you not? I heard the gunshots." "Yes, some outlaws tried to rob the bank. Nothing to worry about now. The sheriff has things in hand." "You are very brave," she said, and he could tell she meant it. "Just doing what needed doing," he replied, suddenly uncomfortable with the praise. "Nothing special." "I think it is special," Winnie said softly. There are not many men who would risk their lives for strangers. They stood there in awkward silence for a moment, and Graham realized he was still holding his hat in his hands, turning it over and over like a schoolboy. He cleared his throat. Well, I should let you get back to your work. I just wanted to say hello. You are welcome to say hello anytime you are passing by, Winnie said, and there was an invitation in her voice that made his heart beat faster. Graham nodded, put his hat back on, and turned Ruby back toward the road. But as he rode away, he could not stop thinking about Winnie Douglas and her simple joy. There was something about her that called to him, something that made him want to be a better man, to find his own contentment in the small moments of life, rather than always chasing the next big thing. The Double R Ranch was owned by Robert and Rebecca Russell, a couple in their 50s who had built their spread from nothing over the past 20 years. They ran about 500 head of cattle and employed a dozen hands, of which Graham was one. He was good at his work, reliable and skilled with horses and cattle alike, and the Russells had come to depend on him for the more difficult tasks. When he arrived back at the ranch that evening, Robert was waiting for him in the barn. Heard there was some excitement in town, Robert said, leaning against a stall door as Graham unsaddled Ruby. Some outlaws tried to rob the bank. Sheriff Garrett took care of it. And you helped, I hear. Tom sent word out with one of the riders. Graham shrugged. It was nothing. Robert chuckled. You are too modest, son. Tom said you saved at least 3 lives with your quick thinking. He paused, studying Graham with the shrewd eyes of a man who had spent decades reading people. But something tells me that is not what has you looking like you have been hit by lightning. Graham felt his face grow warm. I met someone in town, a young woman. Ah, Robert said, and his grin widened. That explains it. Anyone I know? Winnie Douglas. Her father is a carpenter. Matthew Douglas, good man, lost his wife to fever a few years back. Winnie keeps house for him. Robert's expression grew more serious. She is a fine young woman, Graham. Kind-hearted, from what I hear. But her father is protective, as he should be. If you are serious about courting her, you will need to do things properly. I only just met her, Graham protested. I do not even know if she would want me to court her. Then I suggest you find out, Robert said, clapping him on the shoulder. Life is too short to let opportunities pass you by, especially when it comes to matters of the heart. Over the next few weeks, Graham found himself riding past the Douglas house with increasing frequency. Sometimes Winnie was outside, and they would talk for a few minutes. Other times the house was quiet, and he would ride on, disappointed but determined. He learned that she was 22 years old, that she loved to read, though books were hard to come by in Las Cruces, and that she had a passion for growing flowers in the small garden beside the house. She had created a little oasis of color in the dusty brown landscape, with roses and marigolds and even a few delicate lilies that she somehow coaxed to bloom despite the harsh New Mexico sun. Winnie, for her part, seemed to enjoy his visits. She would light up when she saw him coming, and their conversations grew longer and more personal. She told him about her mother, who had been a school teacher before marrying her father, and how she had inherited her mother's love of learning. She spoke of her loneliness since her mother's death, how the house felt too quiet sometimes, even with her father there. Graham found himself sharing things he had never told anyone, about his own family back in Missouri, about his restlessness and his search for a place where he truly belonged. One evening in early August, Graham gathered his courage and knocked on the door of the Douglas house. Matthew Douglas answered, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and the weathered hands of someone who worked with wood for a living. He looked Graham up and down with the critical eye of a father assessing a potential suitor. Mr. Douglas, my name is Graham Lawson. I work at the Double R Ranch. I was hoping I might have permission to call on your daughter. Matthew was silent for a long moment, and Graham felt sweat trickling down his back despite the evening cool. Finally, Matthew stepped aside. Come in, Mr. Lawson. Let us talk. The inside of the house was neat and simply furnished, with handmade furniture that spoke to Matthew's skill as a carpenter. Winnie was setting the table for supper, and she looked up in surprise when she saw Graham. Her father gestured for him to sit in one of the chairs by the fireplace. "Winnie tells me you have been stopping by to talk with her," Matthew said, settling into the chair opposite Graham. "Yes, sir. I hope I have not overstepped." "That depends on your intentions," Matthew said bluntly. "My daughter is the most precious thing in my life, Mr. Lawson. I will not have her heart trifled with." "I would never do that, sir," Graham said earnestly. "I care for Winnie very much. I would like the opportunity to court her properly, with your permission." Matthew studied him for a long moment, then glanced over at Winnie, who was standing frozen by the table, her hands clutching a plate. "What do you think, daughter? Is this what you want?" Winnie's face flushed pink, but she met her father's eyes steadily. "Yes, Papa, it is." Matthew sighed, but there was a hint of a smile on his lips. "Then I suppose I cannot object, but I expect you to treat her with respect, Mr. Lawson, and to have her home at a decent hour when you take her out." "Of course, sir. You have my word." "Then you are welcome to join us for supper," Matthew said, and just like that, Graham became a regular visitor to the Douglas household. The courtship that followed was the happiest time of Graham's life. He and Winnie would take walks in the evening, when the heat of the day had faded and the desert air was cool and sweet. They would talk for hours about everything and nothing, and Graham found himself falling more deeply in love with her with each passing day. It was not just her beauty that captivated him, though she was undeniably lovely. It was her spirit, her kindness, the way she found joy in the smallest things. She would stop to admire a sunset or laugh at the antics of a roadrunner, and her enthusiasm was infectious. She made him see the world differently, made him appreciate the beauty that surrounded him rather than always looking ahead to the next destination. One Sunday in late August, Graham borrowed a wagon from the Russells and took Winnie on a picnic to a spot along the Rio Grande that he had discovered. It was a secluded bend in the river where cottonwood trees provided shade, and the water ran clear and cool. Winnie had packed a basket with fried chicken, biscuits, and apple pie, and they spread a blanket on the grass and ate while watching the water flow past. "This is perfect," Winnie said, leaning back on her hands and tilting her face up to catch the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. "Thank you for bringing me here." "I wanted to find someplace special," Graham said. "Someplace that would be just ours." She turned to look at him, and there was something in her eyes that made his breath catch. "You are special to me, Graham. I hope you know that." "You are special to me, too," he said, reaching for her hand. "More than I can put into words." They sat in silence for a while, holding hands and listening to the river and the birds singing in the trees. Graham knew he was in love with her, had known it for weeks, but he had been afraid to say the words, afraid that it was too soon, or that she might not feel the same way. But now, in this perfect moment, he could not hold back any longer. "Winnie, I love you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I think I have loved you since the moment I heard you humming while doing your laundry. I know we have not known each other long, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life." Winnie's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I love you too, Graham. I was so afraid you would never say it." He pulled her close and kissed her, a gentle, tentative kiss that quickly deepened as she responded. It was his first kiss, and he suspected it was hers as well, and it was everything he had imagined and more. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathless and grinning like fools. "I want to marry you," Graham said impulsively. "I know I should wait, should ask your father first, but I cannot help myself. Will you marry me, Winnie?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation. "Yes, 1,000 times. Yes." They spent the rest of the afternoon making plans, talking about the future they would build together. Graham wanted to save enough money to buy a piece of land where they could start their own ranch, something small at first, but with room to grow. Winnie wanted a house with a big kitchen and space for a garden, and maybe a library if they could afford it. They talked about children, about the life they would create, and with every word, Graham felt his happiness growing. When he took her home that evening, Matthew was sitting on the porch, whittling a piece of wood. He looked up as they approached, and something in their faces must have given them away, because he set down his knife and stood up. "We need to talk to you, Papa," Winnie said, her voice trembling with excitement. "I suspect I know what this is about," Matthew said dryly. "Come inside." Once they were settled in the parlor, Graham cleared his throat and began. "Mr. Douglas, I have asked Winnie to marry me, and she has accepted. I am asking for your blessing." Matthew was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Graham and his daughter. Finally, he spoke. "Graham, you are a good man, I can see that. But marriage is not just about love. It is about providing for a family, about being there through the hard times as well as the good. Do you have the means to support a wife?" "I have been saving my wages, sir. I have nearly $300 put aside, and Mr. Russell has offered to sell me a parcel of his land at a fair price. It is not much, but it is a start. I will work hard to give Winnie a good life." "And what if the ranch fails? What if there is a drought or the cattle get sick?" "Then I will find another way," Graham said firmly. "I will do whatever it takes to provide for her. I love your daughter, Mr. Douglas, and I will spend the rest of my life making her happy." Matthew looked at Winnie. "Is this truly what you want, daughter? You are young yet. There is no rush." "I have never been more certain of anything, Papa," Winnie said. "Graham is a good man, and I love him. I want to be his wife." Matthew sighed, but there was a softness in his eyes. "Then you have my blessing, but I expect you to wait until you have a proper house to bring her to. I will not have my daughter living in some shack." "Thank you, sir," Graham said, relief flooding through him. "I promise you will not regret this." The engagement was announced the following Sunday at church, and the small community of Las Cruces buzzed with the news. Winnie was well liked in town, and several of the older women took it upon themselves to help her prepare for the wedding. Rebecca Russell insisted on hosting a small engagement party at the ranch, where Graham was congratulated by his fellow ranch hands and teased mercilessly about losing his freedom. He took it all in good humor, too happy to care about the ribbing. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. Graham worked harder than he had ever worked, saving every penny and spending his spare time helping Matthew build a house on the parcel of land Robert had sold him. It was only a quarter section, 160 acres, but it had good water and decent grazing. The house was small, just 3 rooms to start with, but it was solid and well made, and Matthew insisted on adding special touches like built-in shelves for Winnie's books and a large window in the kitchen to let in the morning sun. Winnie was busy as well, sewing her wedding dress and preparing her trousseau. She had never been happier, and everyone who saw her remarked on how she seemed to glow with joy. She and Graham saw each other as often as they could, stealing moments together when their work allowed, and every meeting only deepened their love. In early November, with the house complete and the weather still mild, they were married in the small Catholic church in Las Cruces. Winnie wore a dress of ivory silk that had belonged to her mother, altered to fit her smaller frame, and she carried a bouquet of dried roses from her garden. Graham wore his best suit, borrowed from Robert Russell, and he stood at the altar with his heart pounding as he watched Winnie walk down the aisle on her father's arm. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and he had to blink back tears as she joined him at the altar. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Graham kissed Winnie with all the love and promise he felt in his heart. The small congregation cheered, and they walked back down the aisle together, hand in hand, ready to begin their new life. The reception was held at the Douglas house, with food and music provided by friends and neighbors. There was fiddle music and dancing, and Graham danced every dance with his new wife, holding her close and marveling at the fact that she was his. As the sun set and the stars came out, they said their goodbyes and rode together to their new home, where Graham carried Winnie over the threshold and set her down gently in the middle of the kitchen. "Welcome home, Mrs. Lawson," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is perfect," Winnie said, looking around at the simple room with tears in her eyes. "Everything is perfect." That night they made love for the first time, tenderly and with a sense of wonder at this new intimacy they were sharing. Afterward, they lay in each other's arms, talking softly about their dreams and their future, and Graham felt a peace he had never known before. He had found what he had been searching for all his life, and it was not in adventure or wealth or fame. It was in this simple joy, this quiet contentment, this love that filled every corner of his heart. The first winter of their marriage was harder than they had anticipated. The cattle they had managed to buy, just 20 head to start with, proved difficult to keep fed as the grazing grew sparse. Graham spent long days riding the range, checking on the herd and hauling water when the creek ran low. There were times when he came home exhausted and discouraged, wondering if Matthew had been right to question whether he could provide for a wife. But Winnie never complained. She kept the house warm and welcoming, cooked hearty meals that stretched their limited supplies, and always greeted him with a smile and a kiss that made him forget his worries. In the evenings, she would read to him by lamplight, books she borrowed from the few families in the area who had them, and her voice would soothe him until he fell asleep with his head in her lap. One particularly difficult day in January, Graham came home to find Winnie singing as she prepared supper, the same tune he had heard that first day when she was doing laundry. He stood in the doorway, watching her move around the kitchen with that same simple joy she had always possessed, and he felt his heart swell with love. "How do you do it?" he asked, crossing the room to wrap his arms around her from behind. "Do what?" she asked, leaning back against him. "Stay so happy even when things are hard, even when we have so little." She turned in his arms to face him. "We do not have so little, Graham. We have each other. We have this home. We have food on the table and a warm bed to sleep in. What more could we need?" "I want to give you more," he said. "I want to give you everything." "You already have," she said, cupping his face in her hands. "You have given me your love, and that is worth more than all the riches in the world." He kissed her then, deeply and passionately, and she responded with equal fervor. They made love right there in the kitchen, urgent and hungry for each other. And afterward they laughed at their own recklessness. It was moments like these that sustained them through the difficult times, reminding them of what truly mattered. By spring, things began to improve. The rains came, bringing new grass for the cattle, and all 20 head survived the winter. Graham managed to pick up extra work helping Robert Russell with spring branding, and the additional income allowed them to buy seed for a vegetable garden that Winnie planted with great care. She had a gift for growing things, and soon they had tomatoes and squash and beans supplementing their diet. In May, Winnie began to feel unwell in the mornings, and at first she thought it was something she had eaten. But when the nausea persisted for several weeks, she began to suspect the truth. She waited until she was certain before telling Graham, wanting to be sure before raising his hopes. One evening after supper, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, she took his hand and placed it on her still flat belly. "We are going to have a baby," she said softly. Graham stared at her, his eyes wide with shock and then blazing with joy. "Truly? Are you certain?" "I am certain," she said, laughing at his expression. "You are going to be a father." He let out a whoop of excitement and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. Then he set her down carefully, his expression suddenly anxious. "I should not have done that. I might have hurt you or the baby." "We are fine," she assured him, touched by his concern. "The baby is well protected." "A baby," he said wonderingly, placing both hands on her belly. "Our baby. Winnie, I cannot believe it. This is the best news I have ever received." "I am so happy," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I have wanted to tell you for days, but I wanted to be absolutely sure." They spent the rest of the evening making plans, talking about names and whether it would be a boy or a girl. Graham was already planning an addition to the house, a room for the nursery, and Winnie was imagining teaching their child to read and helping them plant their first garden. The future had never looked brighter. Word spread quickly in the small community, and Winnie was inundated with advice from the older women, some helpful and some contradictory. Rebecca Russell took her under her wing, having raised 4 children of her own, and Winnie was grateful for her calm, practical guidance. Matthew was overjoyed at the prospect of becoming a grandfather and immediately set to work building a cradle, crafting it with the same care he had put into building their house. As Winnie's belly grew, so did Graham's protectiveness. He insisted she rest more, worried constantly about her health, and hovered over her until she finally had to shoo him away. But she could not really be annoyed with him because she knew it came from a place of deep love and concern. In October, on a cool evening when the cottonwoods along the creek were turning gold, Winnie went into labor. Graham rode like mad to fetch Rebecca Russell and the midwife, an older Mexican woman named Maria, who had delivered half the babies in Las Cruces. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Graham, pacing anxiously outside, thought he might lose his mind with worry. But finally, just as dawn was breaking, he heard the thin wail of a newborn baby, and Rebecca came out to get him. "You have a son," she said, her face tired but smiling. "And Winnie is doing well." Graham rushed inside to find Winnie propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. She looked up at him with such love and pride that he felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Meet your son," she said softly, pulling back the blanket so he could see the baby's face. The baby was red and wrinkled and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air. Graham reached out with a trembling hand to touch his son's cheek, marveling at the softness of his skin. "He is beautiful," Graham whispered. "He is perfect. You are amazing, Winnie. I cannot believe you did this." "We did this," she corrected gently. "He is ours, Graham. Our son." They named him Matthew Robert Lawson, after both of his grandfathers, and called him Matt for short. Matthew Douglas wept when he heard, and Robert Russell looked equally moved. The baby was welcomed into the world with a small celebration at the ranch, where he was passed around and admired by everyone who knew his parents. Being parents changed everything for Graham and Winnie, but in the best possible way. The nights were sleepless, and the days were exhausting, but every smile, every coo, every tiny milestone filled them with wonder. Graham found himself hurrying home from work just to hold his son, to watch him sleep, to marvel at the tiny life they had created. Winnie bloomed as a mother, patient and nurturing, singing to Matt the same songs her mother had sung to her. As Matt grew, so did their ranch. Graham managed to increase their herd gradually, and by the time Matt was 3 years old, they had nearly 100 head of cattle. It was still small compared to operations like the Double R, but it was theirs, built through hard work and determination. They added on to the house, creating that nursery Graham had promised, and a larger kitchen for Winnie, and slowly but surely they carved out a prosperous life. When Matt was 4, Winnie became pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. In the spring of 1884, she gave birth to a daughter they named Grace Rebecca, after no one in particular, but because the name felt right. Grace was a happy baby with Winnie's dark hair and Graham's blue eyes, and Matt was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to help take care of her. The years that followed were busy and full. The ranch continued to grow, and Graham hired a few hands to help with the work. He proved to have a good head for business, and their cattle brought good prices at market. They were not wealthy by any means, but they were comfortable, and that was all they wanted. Matthew Douglas grew older and eventually moved in with them when his health began to fail. He lived to see Matt start school and Grace take her first steps, and he died peacefully in his sleep one night in the winter of 1886, surrounded by the family he loved. They buried him in the small cemetery in Las Cruces, and Winnie grieved deeply for the father who had been her rock after her mother's death. But she found comfort in Graham and her children, and in the knowledge that her father had been happy in his final years. As Matt and Grace grew, Graham and Winnie made sure to teach them the values they held dear. They taught them to work hard, to be kind, to find joy in simple things. Graham would take Matt out to work with the cattle, teaching him everything he knew, while Winnie taught Grace to read and cook and tend the garden. But both children learned all these skills because Graham and Winnie believed that everyone should be capable and self-sufficient. In the evenings, the family would gather on the porch, and Winnie would hum the same tunes she had hummed all those years ago while doing laundry. Sometimes she would sing the words, songs about love and home and the beauty of the desert. Matt and Grace would join in, their young voices blending with their mothers, and Graham would sit and listen, his heart full to bursting with gratitude for the life they had built. One evening in the summer of 1889, when Matt was 10 and Grace was 5, they were all sitting on the porch watching the stars come out. Grace was snuggled against Winnie, half asleep, while Matt sat on the steps, whittling a piece of wood under his grandfather's patient instruction from beyond the grave, having inherited both his grandfather's skill and his tools. "Papa," Matt said suddenly, "how did you and Mama meet?" Graham and Winnie exchanged a smile, and Graham reached over to take his wife's hand. "Well, son, I was riding through town one day, and I heard your mother singing. She was doing laundry, just humming a little tune, and she looked so happy that I had to stop and listen." "What happened then?" Grace asked, suddenly awake and interested. "I introduced myself," Graham continued, "and we started talking. I fell in love with your mother right then and there, though it took me a while to work up the courage to tell her." "Why?" Matt asked, clearly puzzled by this. "Because love is scary," Winnie said, running her fingers through Grace's hair. "When you love someone, you are giving them your heart, and that means they can hurt you. But it also means you can be happier than you ever thought possible." "Are you happy, Mama?" Grace asked. "I am happier than I ever dreamed I could be," Winnie said, her eyes meeting Graham's. "Your father and I have built a beautiful life together, and you children are the greatest blessing we could ever ask for." "What made you fall in love with Papa?" Matt wanted to know. Winnie thought for a moment. "It was his kindness, I think, and the way he saw me, really saw me. Not just as someone to cook and clean and keep house, but as a person with thoughts and dreams of my own. He made me feel valued and cherished, and he still does every single day. And Mama made me see that happiness is not something you find out there in the world," Graham added. "It is something you create right where you are with the people you love. She taught me to appreciate the simple things, the everyday moments that make up a life. Before I met her, I was always looking ahead, always chasing the next thing. But she showed me how to be present, how to find joy in the here and now." The children listened solemnly, taking in their parents' words. They were too young to fully understand the depth of what was being said, but they would remember this conversation in years to come, when they were older and dealing with their own questions about love and life. As the years passed, the Lawson Ranch continued to thrive. Graham's reputation as an honest, hardworking rancher spread, and he was increasingly sought out for advice by younger men starting out. Winnie became known in the community for her kindness and her beautiful garden, which had expanded to include flowers from all over the territory. She would give cuttings to anyone who asked, wanting to share the beauty she had created. In 1891, when Matt was 12 and Grace was 7, Winnie discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was unexpected, as she and Graham had assumed their family was complete, but it was no less welcome. In early 1892, she gave birth to another son, whom they named Samuel Douglas Lawson, honoring Winnie's family name. Samuel was a quiet baby, more serious than his siblings had been, but sweet-natured and easy to care for. Matt and Grace doted on their baby brother, and the house rang with laughter and activity. Graham looked around at his family one day and could hardly believe this was his life. He remembered that lonely cowboy he had been, drifting from job to job, searching for something he could not name. He had found it in Winnie, in her simple joy and her generous heart, and he thanked God every day for leading him past her house on that fateful afternoon. As the children grew older, Matt began to show a real aptitude for ranching, and it was clear he would eventually take over the operation. Grace proved to be as gifted with growing things as her mother, and she expanded the garden even further, experimenting with different varieties and techniques. Samuel, as he grew, showed an interest in books and learning, and Winnie took special pleasure in teaching him, seeing her own love of reading reflected in her youngest child. In 1898, when Matt was 19, he married a young woman from town named Elena Martinez, and Graham and Winnie built them a small house on the far corner of the property. It was strange at first having their oldest child married and setting up his own household, but it was also deeply satisfying to see him starting his own family. Elena was a lovely girl, kind and hardworking, and she fit into the Lawson family seamlessly. Grace, at 14, was being courted by the son of a neighboring rancher, a young man named Thomas Wade, who seemed genuinely smitten with her. Graham was not quite ready to think about his daughter getting married, but he had to admit that Thomas was a good young man, respectful and honest. Winnie, more practical, was already thinking about wedding plans, though she kept these thoughts to herself for the time being. Samuel, at 6, was still young enough to be wholly their own, and Graham and Winnie treasured this time with their youngest. They knew from experience how quickly childhood passed, and they made sure to savor every moment. One evening in the late summer of 1898, Graham and Winnie took a walk together, something they tried to do as often as possible. They walked along the creek that ran through their property, holding hands and enjoying the cool evening air. It had been 20 years since they had married, and Graham marveled at how the years had flown by. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked suddenly. "Marrying me, I mean. Taking a chance on a cowboy with big dreams and not much else." Winnie stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression serious. "Graham Lawson, I have never regretted a single moment of our life together. You have given me everything I ever wanted and more. We have built something beautiful here, something lasting. Our children are growing up strong and good, and that is because of the foundation we laid together. I was so nervous that day, I knocked on your door to ask your father if I could court you," Graham admitted. "I was sure he would say no, that I was not good enough for you." "You were always good enough," Winnie said, reaching up to cup his cheek. "You are the best man I have ever known, Graham. You are kind and hardworking and honest. You have been a wonderful husband and an amazing father. I am so proud of the life we have built together." "I love you," Graham said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have loved you since the moment I heard you humming while doing your laundry, and I will love you until the day I die." "And I love you," Winnie replied, tears shining in her eyes. "Always and forever." They kissed there by the creek as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. It was a perfect moment, the kind that Winnie had always been so good at recognizing and appreciating. And Graham, who had learned from her to find joy in the simple things, held his wife close and gave thanks for the beautiful life they shared. In 1900, Elena gave birth to Graham and Winnie's first grandchild, a little girl they named Rose. Holding his granddaughter for the first time, Graham felt the same sense of wonder he had felt when his own children were born. The circle of life was continuing, and the legacy he and Winnie had built would go on through the generations. Grace married Thomas Wade in 1901 in a beautiful ceremony held at the ranch. She wore a dress Winnie had sewn for her, using lace that had been saved from Winnie's own wedding dress, and she looked radiant as she said her vows. Graham walked her down the aisle with tears in his eyes, remembering the little girl who had followed him around the ranch, always asking questions and wanting to help. Thomas proved to be a devoted husband, and he and Grace settled on his family's ranch just a few miles away. Samuel continued to excel in his studies, and when he was 16, Graham and Winnie made the difficult decision to send him to school in Santa Fe, where he could get a better education than was available in Las Cruces. It was hard to have him away, but they knew it was the right thing for his future. He came home for holidays and summers, bringing with him stories of the wider world and a broadening perspective that enriched all their lives. As Graham and Winnie entered their 40s, they found a new rhythm to their life. With the children grown and starting their own families, they had more time for each other, and they took full advantage of it. They would ride out together to check on the cattle, working side by side as they had in the early days. They would spend evenings reading together, or talking about the grandchildren, or simply sitting in comfortable silence. One day in 1905, as Winnie was doing laundry in the yard, much as she had been doing that day so many years ago when Graham first saw her, he stopped to watch. She was humming that same tune, and she looked up and caught him staring. "What are you looking at?" she asked, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Just admiring my wife," Graham said, walking over to her. "You are still the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. Even with gray in my hair and wrinkles around my eyes," she teased. "Especially with those things," he said seriously. "They are proof of the life we have lived together, the joys and sorrows we have shared. Every line on your face is precious to me." She set down the shirt she had been scrubbing and dried her hands on her apron, then reached up to kiss him. "You always know just what to say." "I only speak the truth," he said, holding her close. "I am the luckiest man alive, Winnie. To have found you, to have built this life with you, to have watched our children grow and thrive. I could not have asked for more." "We have been blessed," she agreed. "More than we ever deserved." They stood there in the yard, holding each other and listening to the sounds of the ranch around them, the lowing of cattle and the calling of birds and the whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees. It was a simple moment, ordinary in every way, but it was perfect. It was the kind of moment that had defined their life together, the kind of joy that Winnie had always been able to find in the everyday tasks of living. By 1910, Graham and Winnie were grandparents 4 times over. Matt and Elena had 3 children now, Rose and 2 younger boys. Grace and Thomas had a son. The ranch was prosperous, run primarily by Matt now, though Graham still helped out and offered advice. Samuel had finished his schooling and become a teacher, returning to Las Cruces to teach at the school there. He had married a quiet young woman named Sarah, and they lived in town. Graham and Winnie, now in their 50s, had earned the right to take things a bit easier. They still worked, but not with the same intensity as in their younger years. They took pleasure in their grandchildren, spoiling them in the way grandparents do, and watching their own children navigate the challenges of parenthood. One afternoon in the spring of 1910, all the family gathered at the ranch for a celebration of Graham and Winnie's 33rd wedding anniversary. It was a warm day, and tables were set up in the yard, groaning under the weight of food that everyone had contributed. The grandchildren ran around playing games while the adults talked and laughed. At one point, Matt stood up and called for everyone's attention. "I want to say something," he announced. "Papa, Mama, you have given us the greatest gift parents can give their children. You have shown us what it means to love someone completely and unconditionally. You have demonstrated through your actions what it means to work hard, to be kind, to find joy in life. Everything we are, everything we have, is because of the foundation you built." There was a murmur of agreement from the others, and Grace stood up to add her thoughts. "Mama, you taught me that true strength comes from gentleness, that you can be both soft and fierce. You showed me how to find beauty in everything, even in the hardest times. I want to be the kind of mother to my son that you were to us." Samuel spoke last. "Papa, Mama, you let me follow my own path, even when it was different from what you might have chosen for me. You supported my dreams and gave me the tools to achieve them. I hope I can do the same for my own children." Graham felt tears running down his face, and when he looked at Winnie, he saw she was crying too. He stood up, pulling her up with him, and addressed their family. "Your mother and I are the ones who have been blessed. You children have been the joy of our lives, And watching you grow into the fine adults you have become has been our greatest accomplishment. We love each of you more than words can say." Winnie nodded, too emotional to speak, and then Grace started a song, one of the old tunes Winnie used to sing to them. One by one, the others joined in, and the yard filled with music and love. The grandchildren, not understanding what was happening but caught up in the emotion of the moment, stopped their playing to listen. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Graham pulled Winnie aside for a private moment. They walked to the top of a small rise where they could see the whole ranch spread out before them, the house and barns and corrals, the cattle grazing in the distance, the creek winding through the property. "Look at what we have built," Graham said, gesturing to the scene before them. "This is our legacy, Winnie. Not just the land and the cattle, but the family, the love, the values we have passed down." "It is more than I ever dreamed of," Winnie said softly. "When I was a young woman doing laundry in my father's yard, I never imagined I would have all this. I never imagined I would meet someone like you." "I was the one who was lucky," Graham insisted. "I was a drifter searching for something without knowing what it was. And then I heard you humming, saw the joy on your face, and I knew I had found what I was looking for. We found each other," Winnie said, leaning against him, "and we built something beautiful together." They stood there in silence for a while, watching the sun dip below the horizon and the stars begin to appear. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of their family, the laughter and conversation and music that filled their home and their hearts. "Do you remember what I said to you that first day?" Graham asked. "When I stopped and introduced myself? You said you heard my song and it was beautiful," Winnie recalled. "It was the truest thing I have ever said," Graham told her. "Your song, your joy, your spirit has been the music of my life. Every day with you has been a gift." "Oh, Graham," Winnie said, turning to embrace him. "You are going to make me cry again." "Good tears this time, I hope," he said, holding her close. "The best tears," she confirmed. "Tears of happiness and gratitude and love." They returned to the party eventually, but that moment stayed with them, a reminder of how far they had come and how blessed they were. The celebration went on late into the night, and when everyone finally left or retired to their beds, Graham and Winnie sat on their porch, as they had done countless times before. "It has been a good life," Graham said, taking Winnie's hand. "The best life," Winnie agreed. "And it is not over yet. We still have many years ahead of us." "I plan to spend every single one of them loving you," Graham said. "And I will spend them loving you right back," Winnie replied. The years that followed were gentle ones. Graham and Winnie aged gracefully, their health holding steady and their spirits remaining strong. They watched their grandchildren grow and even welcomed great-grandchildren into the world. The ranch passed fully into Matt's hands, but Graham remained involved, offering advice and occasionally helping with difficult tasks. In 1920, when Graham was 68 and Winnie was 66, they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. It was a huge celebration with family and friends coming from all over New Mexico. The ranch was packed with people, and there was music and dancing and more food than anyone could eat. That night, as the party wound down and people began to leave, Graham and Winnie found themselves alone on the porch once again. Winnie was humming softly, that same tune from so long ago, and Graham listened with his eyes closed, letting the music wash over him. "I love that song," he said. "It reminds me of the day we met." "That is why I still hum it," Winnie said. "It reminds me of the moment my life truly began." "Mine too," Graham agreed. "Everything before that was just prelude." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands and watching the stars. They had been together for 50 years, half a century of life shared, and love deepened. They had weathered storms and celebrated triumphs. They had raised children and buried loved ones. They had built a legacy that would outlast them both. "If I could go back and do it all again," Graham said suddenly, "I would not change a single thing." "Not even the hard parts?" Winnie asked. "The drought year? or when Papa died, or the times we struggled to make ends meet. Not even those, Graham said firmly, because they made us who we are. They taught us what was truly important, and they made the good times even sweeter. I feel the same way, Winnie said. Every moment, good or bad, was part of our journey together, and I would not trade that for anything. They continued to sit there, two old people who had loved each other well and built a beautiful life together. The ranch was quiet now, the guests gone, the family asleep in their various rooms and houses. Tomorrow would bring new work, new challenges, new joys. But for tonight, there was just this: the stars overhead, the sounds of the desert night, and the warmth of the hand held in their own. Graham thought back to that young cowboy he had been, riding through Las Cruces on a hot July day, his life stretching out before him, full of possibilities he could not have imagined. He had been looking for something, though he had not known what, and then he had heard Winnie humming, had seen the simple joy on her face as she did her laundry, and everything had changed. That moment had been the beginning of everything that mattered in his life. It had led to love and marriage and children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. It had led to the building of this ranch and this family. It had led to 50 years of happiness and partnership and deep, abiding love. "Thank you," he said suddenly, turning to look at Winnie. "For what?" she asked, puzzled. "For everything. For loving me. For building this life with me. For showing me what true joy looks like. You have been my greatest blessing, Winnie. You are still my greatest blessing. And you are mine," she said, her eyes shining with tears. "Always and forever." They kissed there on the porch, two old lovers who had weathered the storms of life and come through stronger for it. It was not the passionate kiss of youth, but something deeper and more meaningful, a kiss that carried 50 years of love and commitment and shared history. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. Graham helped Winnie to her feet, his movements slower than they had been in his youth, but still steady and sure. Together they walked inside, to the bedroom they had shared for 5 decades, and prepared for bed. As they lay in the darkness, Graham pulled Winnie close, her back against his chest, his arm around her waist. This was how they slept every night, had slept for 50 years, finding comfort and security in the warmth of each other's bodies. "I love you, Winnie Lawson," Graham whispered into the darkness. "I love you, Graham Lawson," she whispered back. And then there was silence, broken only by the sound of their breathing, slow and deep and perfectly synchronized. Outside, the stars continued their eternal dance across the sky, and the land they had worked and loved stretched out in all directions. Inside, two hearts beat in harmony, as they had for half a century, as they would continue to do until the end of their days. The years rolled on, and Graham and Winnie remained devoted to each other. They grew older, their movements slower, and their bodies weaker, but their love never diminished. They spent their days surrounded by family, taking pleasure in the accomplishments of their descendants and the knowledge that their legacy would continue long after they were gone. In the winter of 1925, when Graham was 73 and Winnie was 71, Graham fell ill with pneumonia. It was sudden and serious, and for several days the family gathered at the ranch fearing the worst. But Graham was tough, and with Winnie by his side every moment, refusing to leave him even to eat or sleep, he slowly recovered. When he was finally strong enough to sit up in bed, the first thing he did was reach for Winnie's hand. She looked exhausted, her face drawn and pale from lack of sleep, but her eyes were bright with relief. "You scared me," she said, her voice trembling. "I am sorry," Graham replied, his voice still weak. "But I could not leave you. We still have too much living to do." "Promise me we will grow old together," Winnie said. "Promise me you will not leave me alone." "I promise," Graham said, bringing her hand to his lips. "We will grow old together, just as we planned all those years ago." And they did. Graham recovered fully, and they continued their life together, treasured by their family and respected in the community. They became the patriarch and matriarch of the Lawson clan, their wisdom sought after, and their love story held up as an example of what marriage should be. In 1928, on a warm evening in July, almost exactly 50 years after that first meeting, Graham and Winnie sat on their porch as they had done countless times before. Graham was 76 now, Winnie 74, and both of them moved slowly and carefully, their bodies worn by decades of hard work and life. But their spirits were strong, and their love was as deep as it had ever been. Winnie was humming softly, that same tune from so long ago, and Graham listened with his eyes closed, a smile on his weathered face. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, and the air was cooling as evening approached. "Do you ever think about that day?" Winnie asked suddenly. "The day we met?" "All the time," Graham admitted. "I think about how different my life would have been if I had taken a different route through town that day, or if you had not been outside doing laundry, or if I had not stopped to listen. God brought us together," Winnie said with certainty. "It was meant to be." "I believe that," Graham agreed. "Everything in my life led me to that moment. To you. It was destiny." They fell silent again, both lost in their memories. Graham thought about all the moments that had made up their life together, the big ones and the small ones, the triumphs and the tragedies. He thought about their wedding day and the births of their children. He thought about the hard years and the good years, the laughter and the tears. And through it all, there had been Winnie, his constant companion, his partner in everything, the love of his life. "I want you to know something," Graham said, his voice serious. "When my time comes, whenever that may be, I want you to know that I have lived a full and happy life. I have no regrets, Winnie. You gave me everything I ever wanted and more." "Do not talk like that," Winnie said, tears filling her eyes. "We have many more years together." "We do," Graham agreed. "But I want you to know anyway. You have been the greatest gift of my life, Winnie. Loving you has been my life's greatest joy. And loving you has been mine," Winnie said, reaching over to take his hand. "We have built something beautiful together, Graham. Something that will last long after we are gone." They sat there as the stars began to appear, holding hands and remembering. They thought about their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all the lives that had come from their union. They thought about the ranch and the land they had worked and improved, leaving it better than they had found it. They thought about the community they had helped to build, the friendships they had forged, the difference they had made. But most of all, they thought about each other, about the love that had sustained them through 50 years of marriage and all the challenges that had come with it. They had started with nothing but youth and hope and a deep attraction, and they had built a life that was rich beyond measure. Not in money or possessions, though they were comfortable enough, but in love and family and purpose. As the night deepened and the air grew cool, Graham helped Winnie to her feet, and together they walked inside. They moved slowly, supporting each other, two people who had become so intertwined over the decades that it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. They prepared for bed in the comfortable silence of long familiarity, each knowing what the other needed without words being necessary. When they lay down, Graham pulled Winnie close, as he always did, and she settled against him with a contented sigh. This was home, this closeness, this warmth, this love that had only grown deeper with time. "Good night, my love," Graham whispered. "Good night, my darling," Winnie whispered back. And in the darkness, as sleep claimed them both, they smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring them another day together, another day to find joy in the simple things, another day to love each other. It was all they had ever wanted, all they had ever needed. They had found in each other the happiness that others spent their whole lives searching for, and they were grateful beyond words for the gift they had been given. The years might continue to pass, their bodies might continue to age, but their love would remain constant, unchanging, eternal. It had started with a simple moment, a cowboy hearing a woman humming while doing laundry and being captivated by her simple joy. and from that moment had grown a love story for the ages, a testament to the power of finding beauty in everyday moments and choosing to build a life based on love, respect, and shared values. Graham and Winnie Lawson had lived well and loved well, and when their story was told by their descendants in years to come, it would be with pride and joy and a deep appreciation for the legacy they had left behind. They had shown that true happiness came not from grand gestures or exciting adventures, but from the quiet contentment of a life shared with someone you loved, from finding joy in simple tasks, from appreciating the beauty that surrounded you every day. And so they lived, deeply in love, surrounded by family, grateful for every moment they had been given. Their story was one of hope and love and the enduring power of connection, a reminder that sometimes the greatest adventures were the ones we embarked on right where we were, with the people we chose to love. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the desert night wrapped around them, Graham and Winnie Lawson slept peacefully, two souls who had found their perfect match, two hearts that would beat as one until the very end.